Another weekend of PQs is in the books. Our data set's getting stronger, and we're going to be able to use it to make some better predictions and get a better understanding of the meta and how it's progressing. We're going to first look back at week 1, then see how it's changed going into week 2, look at most played decks, best performing decks, maybe some trend shifts and direction in the meta, cover the general state of the meta. Then we're going to look at a tier list update, and close out by talking about the decks that I would recommend for the upcoming weeks of PQ season, going into this slightly slower holiday time. Looking back at week 1, the big standout in week 1 was that there were only 2 unique leader plus base pairings over 5% of the meta, being Anakin DV at 11.5% and Han1 Green at 5.8%. This was an incredibly wide meta. It can somewhat be expected going into a new set release, especially with the ban being somewhat recently before the new set came out, disrupting the set 5 metagame. But this is very wide. We're seeing 143 unique leader base pairs. There was, in any given PQ, between a 25 and 50% chance that there was a reasonable chance in any given PQ that 25 to 50% of that PQ would just be singleton decks. That is just almost mind-boggling that it is just that wide. What this means is decks that are going to find success, one might tend to be proactive, although we're not really seeing that be the case, but beyond that, just generally powerful, which we are seeing. It is the most generally powerful decks that have a game plan that can be applied to many different scenarios that are finding the most success in this early Secrets of Power metagame. And the other thing is, decks that want to target the meta are going to be a bit weak, because you're not really going to be able to predict what your matchup spread is. Like, if you're building a deck, like in my case, I have a great example here. Tals in Yellow, I was designing to primarily beat Anakin DV, primarily beat Han1 Green, Han2 variants, maybe be okay into Qi'ra. Basically, the decks that are the most represented in the meta, but then that's barely... We're not even probably up to a third of the meta at that point. And then there's a big portion of the meta that deck loses to, meaning it's not going to be able to find success by implementing this targeting strategy. Big reason why I switched off the deck going into this last weekend of PQs, which worked out well for me. The best decks of week 1, looking at the sample size, having a good sample size is really important so that we can know that the data is at least somewhat reliable, especially because we're working with such small numbers at this point. They're getting better now. Han1 Green, Qi'ra DV, Yoda DV, all very good match win rate percentages. That's just their cumulative match win rates over the course of all players playing them and all PQs, and very good conversion rates. Their conversion rates, especially for Yoda and Han1 Green, were exceptionally high. Han1 sitting around 28%, Yoda sitting around 33% conversion rate. That's their ability for any player that's picking up the deck to get top 8 from that pool. So 1 out of 3 Yoda players, basically, and a little closer to 1 out of 4 than 1 out of 3 Han1 Green players being able to convert their run into a top 8. Qi'ra DV sitting just a little bit below that. I think it was around 25, 26. The big standout from week 1 was that Yoda Green DV just put up crazy numbers, as we just looked at. It had a win rate also into the 60s. I believe it was around like 67%. It was incredibly well performing. So it is no surprise that jumping to week 2, people picked up on that, and it became the most played deck. We see Anakin dropping down, and we see Yoda going up, jumping over a bunch of other decks to end up being the most played deck in week 2 PQs. Big thing that stood out here, still only 4 unique leader plus base pairings over 5% of the meta. It is now 2 more than the week before, but it's still extremely low. This is still only making up a very small percentage of the metagame around 30% now, so we are starting to get to a reasonable number of decks that we can be like, okay, we are going to see some number of these decks most likely in our run, and then can work towards tuning for that, but it is still very, very wide. The actual number of unique leader plus base pairs went up. We went up to 148, not a significantly different number, but still going up, which is crazy. And then the advice would remain the same: generally powerful deck, avoid strategies that are targeting the best decks but might be weak to something else. Best decks week 2: Han1 Green, Yoda DV, Qi'ra DV, and Han2 ECL by a wide margin was the best performing. We're going to go into that in our analysis of the top decks coming up. The overall meta distribution between week 1 and week 2 was mostly the same. There wasn't a meaningful shift. There is a very small uptick towards control. We saw stuff like Anakin DV go from 5 last played to 7 played this week. Just small shifts like that. Palpatine slight shift up. Nothing meaningful, but it is something to keep an eye on as weeks progress. Compared to that first week, we might start seeing a slow trend towards control, which then could lead towards other trends or directions, like a shift towards faster decks. Looking at win rates, conversion rates, and matchup spreads for the most played decks currently, starting out with the most played to the least played, or the most played of the top 5 to the least played of the top 5, and then also throwing in Han2 ECL here because I think it's important to look at that one. Yoda DV, strong win rate. It had an incredibly high win rate over a small sample last weekend. It shouldn't be expected to maintain that with more players, especially that just average players picking up this deck. It will fall slightly, but holding at 57.8% with players just swapping onto this deck this week, and it's still that high, is incredibly impressive. And still a very good conversion rate at 23%. This deck is the real deal. It is something that people should be very, very aware of going into these future weeks. We do see that there are some cracks in its armor. The two that stand out the most are, I guess there's 3 in particular, but they're Admiral Piett, Sabine ECL, and Han2 ECL. The reason why Sabine is a little, not to me personally, but according to the data, it is there, and that's because at my PQ there were literally 0 Sabines, and in my local area there's just basically no Sabines in the Northeast. Everyone's just off of it. Even Han2 ECL isn't really represented, which, you know, that is odd. We'll go into that later, why that's odd. So there are some cracks in Yoda's armor. We're seeing 3 decks that are, 2 of them are reasonable against it. 1 deck seems to be absolutely crushing it in Han2 ECL. Sample sizes are still too small to really say that this is definitive, but for the most part, this is just eating everything else, at least the most represented decks in the metagame. This is also, by the way, looking at the win rate and the conversion rate are looking at specifically this last weekend, but then to have better matchup data, I am adding in every tournament in Secrets of Power from Seattle, first PQ weekend, second PQ weekend for all of these. So it's doing very well against Anakin, very well against Han1, and reasonable into Qi'ra. Yoda, very strong pick. Looking at Anakin DV, we are seeing its win rate continually fall. It's now at 52.8%. It was like around 55, 56, I think, last week. Conversion rate has remained reasonable. So current conversion rate is 19.6. I think it was around 18 point something in week 1. It's still showing that a player that is skilled on the deck, has some level of deck mastery on it, or just understanding really of how the deck is supposed to function, is converting with it. But because that win rate is falling, it's low, that means that players have to be doing fairly poorly with Anakin to offset the fact that it has a high conversion rate, meaning the people that are converting with it, they must have good win rates with it. So the fact that we're seeing that 52.8% win rate means the average player that's picking this up, people that are just switching to it, something is not clicking for them. And the deck is proving to be hard to pilot and hard to navigate some matchups. If we look at that matchup data, look at all that red. We're seeing Han1 be losing, Admiral Piett, Yoda, Qi'ra, going further down the list, like Gar's losing, and then the winning matchups are very winning, but it's Sabine shifting out of the meta, Boba Dadavalt shifting out of the meta, Cad shifting out of the meta. The decks that this is primarily capitalizing on, at least for the average player, are decks that are on the downtrend. And the decks that make up the core of the meta, it's losing to. Some of them it's losing to hard. Most of them, actually. 3 of those top 4 there, very poor win rate into. While this might be a good deck to play if you have that high level of mastery where you are in the green for these matchups, I know, for example, Wu Ophir thinks that Anakin is very favored into Qi'ra, which is in contrast to this data. I know that people on my team think that they've figured out and have shown, like Tyler's Dark has now top 8 a PQN, second to PQN, did really well at Battle, have shown that they do convert with this deck, and this matchup data does not apply to them, at least in their sample so far. But for the average player, you may want to be moving away from this deck. Han1 Green. This deck has been performing very, very well throughout the entire set, even while it's being targeted to an extent. It's maintained a consistent win rate around 58%. It's maintained a reasonably strong conversion rate. It has fallen. In week 1, it was 28%, so it's down to 23%. There is something to note there. And a big part of that, Rise in Yoda. Look how bad that Yoda matchup is. Qi'ra, also not that great. It is doing at least 50-50 into Anakin, which is nice, but Anakin's also seemingly on a downtrend, which I expect to continue. And then it is absolutely stomping Admiral Piett, which I will say it does seem like a good amount of the Pietts are from that northeast region. We had, I think it was 6 out of 56 people. It was over 10% of our, which is crazy. Like when you look at that deck and it's like 5% of the meta overall. Last week it was like 4 point something percent of the meta, and that the Cherry Hill, New Jersey PQ. Again, Piett was just way overrepresented, so they do seem a little bit concentrated in the Northeast to some extent. So maybe this won't be as applicable if you're in another region. Han1 Green might not have that deck to target, but currently in the Northeast area, Han1 can capitalize on that. But then extending beyond that, looking at that Yoda matchup, Yoda was 20% of my PQ, is around 12 out of 56 decks. And now that's the most played deck, and Han1's losing to it. This deck does carry some amount of risk, but it does have the benefit of rewarding deck mastery, being a very proactive and fast strategy, which it will be able to capitalize on that against a lot of matchups, especially in this very wide meta. Not necessarily going to hit that Yoda or that Qi'ra. And then look at the rest of it. Have a good chance of winning. Piett Red. This has maintained a fairly average win rate, 52.8%. That's nothing really that crazy. And 15.8% conversion rate, actually the same exact conversion rate and win rate week 1 and week 2, which is odd and surprising. Same number of people played it, same number of people converted with it. Then looking at the full sample of data we have for this deck, we are seeing, like we just talked about, it lose very hard to Han1 Green and also lose to Qi'ra. These are 2 popular decks in the meta currently. It does make choosing Piett a pretty big risk. It does do very well into Anakin. It's reasonable into Yoda. And then, you know, the data kind of tapers off there. It's showing mostly 50-50. Yoda Green Force that did really well into. This is one of the ones where we're starting to get down to the sample isn't large enough yet to really be giving us that reliable data. And we will get more in the coming weeks to back up its spot in the metagame, but it does seem a little weak because it's losing to two of the most played decks currently in the meta. So similar to Han1 Green, could be a good choice, could get a good bracket for it, especially with how wide the meta is, but there's that chance that you just get knocked out by hitting one of those really, like, those are really bad matchups. That Han1 Green is especially bad. Moving on to Qi'ra DV, that's maintained 56% win rate, about the same as week 1, and a very strong conversion rate, 25.9%, slightly higher than, I think it was like 25% in week 1. And we are seeing a lot of green here. This is kind of crazy how much green there is. It's winning into all of the most played decks, at worst being maybe 50-50 into the average Yoda Green Data Vault player, having some issues further down the line, with the one that really stands out because it does have a reasonable sample of 13 being Han2 ECL. That is definitely something that Qi'ra needs to look at and maybe try to figure out, or just accept that, like, hey, deck's not played that much, meta's very wide, I'm just not going to hit a Han2 ECL. Might not be the case, especially with the way Han2 ECL is looking into the current meta, which we will get to momentarily. But for the most part, Qi'ra looks like it is one of the best, if not just the generally best choice currently. Han2 ECL. So this was not the 6th most played deck in week 2, but I did want to pull it out as that extra deck because it just, wow, it was incredible this week. Its win rate went from 51.4% to 67.5%, and its conversion rate went from 22.2 to 57.1. I think it put like 11 people or something into top 8. That is insane. And actually, and it closed at least one of the top 8s from the initial data that we saw. And then if you look at its matchups, this is the deck that the faster deck, the aggro deck, the deck that we're kind of missing from the meta that can really pressure the slower decks and not lose to the value strong mid-range piles like Han1 Green, like Anakin DV. This is doing well into them. It's not even just like slightly losing, which is probably where you'd want it to be as that aggressive strategy that's good against the slower decks. It's actually slightly favored into Anakin and Han1 over this small sample, and then it's crushing Yoda. It's doing crushing Qi'ra. Like, this looks like it is so well positioned moving forward, with the one concern being Admiral Piett, and then, you know, it's only 4 and 7 into it. Boba Fett being 2 and 6. Boba Fett should be on the downtrend. Piett should also be on the downtrend, but doesn't always happen that way. It's only 4 and 7 into Piett, though. This could be the real deal. This could be the way that we want to be attacking the meta currently. Yoda is going to be very highly played. I expect Qi'ra might slowly start ticking up, and this is going to be the deck to play to beat those slower decks. And like I said earlier, we are seeing a very, very, or potentially, because we only have that 1 week comparison so far, we are seeing that slight trend that might be going towards control. Han2 ECL, the deck that you can choose to fight that direction of the meta without sacrificing the matchups that Sabine sacrifices in Anakin, in Han1. That brings us to the tier list update. This is a very big difference from my last week's tier list. It is very similar to, or not very similar, but somewhat similar to my Beatle tier list. I did remove a lot of decks. It was just getting too bloated. I do intend to have an extended tier list available. Probably will just put it up on screen moving forward in future videos, but we're just going to look at this one for this video. Yoda, I'm putting at the top for now. Han1 Green was the top, looking at week 1 data. Moving forward, and I thought Yoda actually might warrant its top placing moving into week 2. And maybe I should have done that. And now looking at week 2 beyond, going into these next few holiday weeks of PQs, I'm hesitant to have Yoda in first. I think Han2 ECL or Qi'ra might be the best deck to choose currently. Han2 ECL is essentially the replacement of Sabine that we've needed. the deck that can beat all of these slower decks in tier 2 that are kind of popping up maybe a little bit in the meta, or like the meta's shifting towards them slightly because of these tier 2 decks that are doing well into the tier 1 decks. Basically all of these tier 2 decks except for Han2 Blue and Piett, Palpatine Colossus through Rey data vaults. They're these slower, grindier decks, and the blue, like good removal, good big value units, strong units. Especially this is skewing towards villainy, and that's a nod towards how strong the green value units are. Blue gets some better removal and some better, at this point, kind of like mid-game ships that you can just drop in those capital ships and try to lock out some amount of the board with and turn the corner with. But if the game progresses too much longer beyond that, let's say that there's that Fell the Dragon, Rivals Fall, Vanquish for this ship that killed one thing and then gets answered by one card, so the ship does 2 for 1, but then Yoda does something, or just green heroism does something like they're on 14 resources and they go like home 1, Kellerin, something else. Wow, that one card just gave them a Kellerin and like 2 more cards. One of them is 7/7 ground, one of them is 7/7 space, giving restore. Oh my god, these green heroic decks can just grind. And that's why, even with blue villainy being a potential option, and that's largely because of the strength of these leaders that you're seeing here, not so much Iden, not so much Rey, but the 2 Palpatines and Kylo, those leaders are just providing enough value to actually contest what Yoda is doing and maybe be able to go over the top of it. And then they're also pretty good to reasonable into like Anakin, Han1. They're considered counters to Qi'ra. If anything, they're considered harder counters to Qi'ra than they are to Yoda. Han2 ECL, though, that's the deck. It's beating basically, or going at worst even into all the tier 1, or beating them. And now it's also beating all the tier 2, which, while these aren't the most represented decks, it's tier 3 is probably the next level of most represented decks after tier 1. We might be seeing that trend towards this, which then Han2 ECL, way to go. To talk about Piett and Han2 Blue briefly, Piett is a deck that we looked at. It can target a few things, but then gets targeted really heavily by a few things. It is performing better than it did at Beatle in week 1 and week 2 of PQs, not by much. That's primarily because of the rise of decks like the rise of decks like Yoda and the rise of decks like Anakin. If the meta had gone towards stuff like Han1 Green and Qi'ra, Han2 ECL, well, it actually does do well into Han2 ECL, because of Han2 ECL actually has trouble racing it because of the 25 health and not having good targets to ambush in the ground, aside from like the Piett flip or something they played earlier. So Piett actually well positioned against Yoda, Anakin, and Han2 ECL, which does give that deck a lot of value currently, or a lot of appeal in the meta. It's just, if you hit that Han1 Green or that Qi'ra, you're probably going to have a bad time. Or if you hit any of these other tier 2 decks that might be trending upwards, probably going to have a bad time. And then Han2 Blue, just a very consistent 50-50 deck, but it is skewing a little bit more towards that 45 side of things than that 55 side of things. Still a very, very strong deck. It's just, it's not really getting there as much as a lot of these other decks around it. Then in tier 3, we have a lot of the faster decks, and the issue with these faster decks and why they've kind of been getting pushed out of the meta, although they're still seeing a reasonable amount of play, is because of how poor they are into all of tier 1. They're very good into the tier 2 decks, but the tier 2 decks are at a play rate that is lower than the tier 1 decks in this list. So if the tier 3 decks are beating the tier 2 decks, but not the tier 1 decks, and the tier 2 decks are the lowest played decks, they're not going to do well. The biggest issue is that these decks just don't deal with these like mid-range piles and these super efficient control decks that, well, they can't get past them. So where these will shine is if the tier 2 gets better, but then it brings up the question, coming back to Han2 ECL, is if Han2 ECL is that faster deck that does all the things that the faster deck needs to do, why ever play any of these over Han2 ECL? probably wouldn't. But so yeah, these make up tier 3 because of how they're just not doing well into tier 1 decks essentially. And then tier 4, these are kind of just the decks that can get there. Maybe they're just kind of just like slightly losing into mostly or they're either slightly losing into mostly everything or losing a lot into a good number of things while targeting a very few things. Gar, for example, doing very well against Anakin and Piett, but not great against much else. I can do also okay into like stuff like Han1, like, and then as it gets, you know, it's very bad into the other aggro decks and the tier 3, which are a decent amount of the meta. And then there's decks in tier 1 that can just capitalize on Gar. And then the rest of tier 4, like Cad Bane has been represented a lot, has a 0%, no top 8s yet at all. Luke, similar, has like either no or one top 8 and has had a reasonable amount of plays. Talzin Red, Boba Dadavault, Boba Yellow, same story for all of them. They're just not really doing anything in the meta, which why they're ranked so low. So this brings us to my current recommendations going into these next few weeks. Qi'ra DV, I think that that's my number one recommendation. It might be Han2 ECL. I'm still going back and forth on that a lot. Qi'ra DV, as we saw, seems to have the best overall matchup spread. This is at least into the average players, a very good chance of getting to top 8. Hasn't won any top 8s yet, but it's gotten a good number of seconds, good number of top 4s. It's able to close out a top 8 for sure, even though we haven't seen it yet this set, and just has that very, very consistent matchup spread. There's not really anything that's an issue for it. Han2 ECL according to the data, and then Anakin according to testimony of very strong Qi'ra players against very strong Anakin players. Anakin might be an issue. I also played against an Anakin at my PQ this last weekend as Qi'ra. It was my one loss in rounds, and it did feel extremely hard, while when I've played against others online, it is not, it's been fairly easy. Han2 ECL, if it wasn't for Piett, I think if it wasn't for Piett being so represented in my local meta, I would hands down slam this deck, not even think twice about it. It's strong into most of the meta, like it's at worst 50-50, if not slightly favored, into these mid-range piles that are normally beating these aggressive strategies, like Anakin, like Han1. And then it also just crushes Yoda and Qi'ra, which are two of the arguably strongest decks in the meta. I would actually, as you see here, they're two of my top 3 choices currently are Yoda and Qi'ra, and this is the deck to play to beat those decks. It is filling, as I mentioned before, the role that Sabine ECL filled in the meta that we really need filled again. We really need that aggro deck that can survive these mid-range piles and attack these slower strategies back in the meta. This is it. I'm expecting this to perform very well over the coming weeks, and we will have to see. As such, it's one of my top recommendations. And then Yoda DV. This is kind of, I think, where you players should like go to default at the moment. This is the proven deck. It's not an incredible amount of the meta. Should be about 10%, like in my PQ was 20%, which is starting to get pretty high. So you don't have an incredibly high chance of mirrors. It's going to just be performing well in general, good chance of getting the top 8. We're seeing it take down events. It's getting those firsts that we really want to convert once we get to top 8. It's got really good matchups into 2 of the most played decks, Han1 and Anakin. The issue here being Han2 ECL, Piett Red. They can be issues for it, especially Han2 ECL. So there is some consideration. Is this the deck to choose if Han2 ECL and or Piett Red is going to be very represented locally? Overall, though, these are not highly played decks. Even if Piett's in the top 5 most played decks, it's still barely over 5%. It's not that high chance of hitting a Piett. So to close this video, I got top 8 at Bearded Dragon PQ in New Jersey with Qi'ra this past weekend. Woo, yay! That was nice. I last second switched to the deck. I had been really struggling with Talzin into the space decks. They had knocked me out of the last PQ. They had knocked me out of Beatle. And then I think it was Yoda in particular that just put the nail in the coffin. The Yoda matchup just also felt slightly unfavored. So now I had space decks hitting me from one side, Yoda, which I was expecting to be on the uptrend, hitting me from the other. I'm like, okay, I'm not beating enough of the meta to really be targeting it. And then also the meta is just so wide. Why am I trying this targeting strategy if I'm going to be weak to decks that are going to be populating this extremely wide meta? So literally day before, big shout out to my team and our friends for helping me get the cards together for Qi'ra, since I didn't have a lot of the newer ones. Ran it at Bearded Dragon PQ. Beat matchup spread was Vader Yellow. Felt very dominant in both of those. Then it was Yoda Data Vault. I have struggled a little bit into them, but for the most part, it has felt fairly clean. I would say against a very, very skilled Yoda Data Vault, it might be 50-50, maybe slightly unfavored, but cleared that one 2-0. Then hit my teammate Tyler Dark on Anakin. That I had some pretty awkward hands and got absolutely eviscerated. 0-2, that was not fun. Maybe even if I had better hands, that still wouldn't have worked out that well. Then I played 2 Han1 Greens in a row. Sadly, the last one being one of my teammates who, if he had been the next table up, could have drawn in and had the record to draw in, but I was in a position where I had to play it out. Very upsetting that we had to get matched up into each other. But the Han1 Green matchup, very, very favored for Qi'ra. I felt very confident going into those last 2 rounds. Ended up taking second seed after, with the top four people having drawn for round 5 and 6. So that felt really good. Qi'ra felt really good. I obviously recommend playing it. As of the time of recording, I will be playing one of the 3 decks I recommended in this video. And coaching. So McClunky recently offered coaching. It's in our Discord. The link to our Discord will be in the description of this video. Please feel free to join and reach out. We have a roster of coaches providing expertise on a variety of decks and game skills and subjects. Highly recommend. Come check us out. And then Patreon. I might be launching a Patreon soon. I'm considering it. Might be a little bit too early to talk about that or even mention it at this point. We'll see how things progress. It would be basically providing a lot more content than I even currently am behind the Patreon wall. That would be like daily updates, my personal deck lists, access to a Discord where you can watch me play, access to my tier list in real time instead of like a weekly snapshot, or if it ends up being like a few weeks until the next update, a more just like whenever I'm updating it, it'll be updated there. So that may be coming. We'll see what happens. If it's something you're interested in, just let me know. And if you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the algorithm a lot, and I very much appreciate it. May the cards be with you, and thank you for watching. Now there's like some stuff that floats on the screen or something at the end, right? Seen that in videos or something? Just like sit here and look at recommended videos.